Welcome back, everybody. We are going to continue. Thank you for joining again in this webinar. And we're going to continue with our second speaker of the day, Olof Lidahl. He is a project leader, group leader at the Uppsala Antibiotic Center in economics. He works at the Department of Business Studies, but he also works with us as project coordinator and representing the disciplinary domain of humanities and social sciences, which is an important area for our center as well. We tend to think about antibiotic resistance as a very medical issue, but there are a lot of disciplines that involve the humanities and the social sciences that have a lot to do and to be with the solutions of AMR. And Olof today is going to talk to us about a new economic model for drug development that is based on potentially the susceptibility of these strains, and it's called this antibiotic susceptibility bonus. Olof, I leave the stage and screen to you, and thank you so much for joining us and telling us about your work.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you also for that very nice introduction. Indeed, I'm going to present to you a new incentive or new economic model for drug development, which is piping hot in the sense that we sent in the scientific report yesterday to VR. So this is a very opportune moment to also share some of the key results as well as the overall approach of our project with you guys. So I will cover quite a lot of ground today, since I want to introduce the business and economics of AMR and the industry perspective early on, and then move into what problem are we trying to address in this project. In doing so, I realized there could be some questions as we move along. If so, please send questions in the chat, and then Eva can perhaps interrupt me, and we can try to answer those as we go along. All right. So thank you all for having me. I'm going to talk about this project that was actually an answer to a call by JPI AMR and by Vetenskapsrådet here in Sweden, the Swedish Research Council, to the Joint Transactional Call for Proposals 2017. And this project was called specifically, it's a quite wordy title, Aligning Industry Incentives with AMR Control Goals, exploring the feasibility of an antibiotic susceptibility bonus for drugs to treat gram-negative infection. So this bonus is the product we have tried to develop in this project. And the collaborators of the project, which will be introduced later on as well, is the University of Calgary, University Hospital of Geneva, and Uppsala University. As promised, the business and economics of AMR, I'm going to talk about the state of the antibiotics industry, how we can understand that from a business perspective, what is being done about this state, and how does the project I just mentioned fit into this attempt at trying to fix the industry. I'm going to comment a bit on who we are as a project team and why we are together working on this project, as well as focus on some key conclusions and results from a project, as well as questions for future research. So when we talk about AMR, as Eva pointed out, it's often we often think about it as a health problem and as a clinical problem, which of course it definitely is. But behind that is also a problem with an industry that is malfunctioning, an industry where incentives are misaligned. And the result of that misalignment is that you have a global antibiotic industry decline that has been going on for decades. What this means is that while we are struggling with resistance and trying to keep resistance development at bay, the pipeline of new antibiotics is not being refilled. So antibiotics are becoming very much a finite product, finite resource. We can see this, for example, and this is just an example of a number of antibiotics and number of cancer drugs coming to market. And we can see a decline in the antibiotic side and a steep increase in the cancer drug side. And for those of you who don't know, you can't make money in antibiotics. You can make a lot of money in cancer drugs. So from a business perspective, that would be one of the main suspects in this when looking at this graph. And indeed, companies are leaving, have been leaving for a long time the antibiotic industry. Much more companies are leaving than are coming in. How are they leaving? Well, some are leaving voluntarily by just canceling their antibiotic drug development programs. Unfortunately, other ones are getting booted out of the industry. One of the latest horrific examples of that is Achaogen, who launched their new antibiotic, plazomicin, in 2018. And they went bankrupt the year after. So they developed a drug for decades, and then they come to market, and it was one of those drugs that we actually wanted and needed and had expressed great enthusiasm about. But they still went bankrupt because the sales were very low. And this is a story that is unfortunately quite characteristic for the industry. And it's highly problematic, as I will explain in a moment, because other firms see this. Even research students see this and realize that if I want a job and then not have a job anymore, then maybe this is for me. Jokes aside, this is not a good signal for anyone. So it's not, Achaogen is not just about Achaogen. There is a herd situation, as in most human things. So what is wrong with antibiotics, the antibiotics industry? Well, if we look a little bit at pharmaceuticals in general, you have spend on the left-hand side of this cutting point here. Costs to develop takes a long time, but you get good sales, and so you make a profit, and you can continue to develop a new drug, basically. You live to fight another day. So this is the regular business model of pharma. In antibiotics, I've added another, or we have added another break-even line here, but you can see that, hey, the costs are the same, the revenues are very low. So this line helps us to understand, how big of a hole have we dug ourselves into by developing this drug, and then how can we get out of that hole by selling it? And when it comes to antibiotics, it costs as much as producing other drugs, or developing other drugs, but you actually don't get the sales. This is what happened to Achaogen. They got sales in the first year of some $800,000, which is chump change when it comes to drug development. And so then, basically, I guess you can't pay your bank loans, and you have to go bankrupt. So antibiotics is special in a bad way in this sense. And so why is this? Well, you have the costs, you have the uncertainty, but you don't have the revenues. So you are not selling in the market. Of course, it's also a science challenge, but being the business economic guy, I will stick to the business challenges. But what I can say is, of course, that difficulties in developing drugs leads to higher costs and to greater uncertainty. So it becomes a business problem when you face challenges also in science, because difficult things cost money, essentially. So from a business and economic standpoint, what we try to do very generally then is to look at the firms of the industry, because the industry as a whole is in very bad health, but the industry as a whole doesn't necessarily, well, it exists, but there is an industry because there are firms. Some firms are still in this industry. A lot of small firms, not so many big firms. So what we want to do is understand firm behavior. What makes firms try to develop new drugs? What makes firms succeed in developing new drugs? So attempting to R&D, succeeding to R&D, and of course, profiting from R&D. And when we talk about health, when we talk about life and death, then talking about profits becomes feels always a bit dirty. But we have to understand that is a condition for companies doing anything, and that is on heartbreaking display in the antibiotics industry, because they're not making money, so they go away, either for good or just leave. So we need to study why firms attempt to do R&D, what lures firms to, despite the odds, do R&D in antibiotics. How could they perhaps be lured into or motivated to do R&D? What effects if they succeed? And finally, profiting. And this matters. This last point matters more than we might think, because if you think about firms attempting to do R&D but then not succeeding, then there's a feedback loop where other firms watch their competent colleagues in that other company fail. Similarly, if they actually succeed, like a Qiagen, but don't profit and get fired, everyone got fired, then everybody saw that. I mean, we're talking about it now. So of course, people in other firms developing antibiotics know all about this. And it's a discouraging story. So that means that we need to understand what leads firms to these sorry ends, because it has an impact way beyond the single firm. It's I mean, firms, like people, like anything, is a bit like a flock of birds, right? So if one is scared, everybody else takes off, and it works a little bit like that. So it's important to prevent future Qiagen situations, well, especially with regards to the bankruptcy rather than the success in innovation. But when studying firm behavior, these are the kinds of things we look at. Why do firms behave in a certain way? And how can that be affected or perhaps incentivized? How can the willingness of firms to innovate in antibiotics be further stimulated or motivated? So what is being done to support firms doing R&D? Well, you can very briefly understand it by thinking about push and pull. So this is a more elaborate and colorful costs, the red stuff, revenues, the green stuff, illustration of the journey, where generally speaking in antibiotics, the costs are much bigger than the revenues. There's also a problem that I will get back to later, which is that costs happen now, revenues happen in 10 years or something like that, which means, you know, if we just go to our own personal finance situation, how would you pay for it? Well, you probably have to take out a loan. So is that unproblematic? No, because you have to pay an interest on that loan. So having big costs early and relatively small revenues late is a bigger problem than it might look on this type of illustration. Now, when trying to incentivize firms or make it easier for firms to stay in antibiotics or get back into antibiotics, there's generally push or pull incentives, as we call them. Push is trying to be, in some kind of jogging analogy, would be the friendly hand in the back that helps you get across the finish line. While in the pull analogy, basically it's about innovation prizes, where you try to incentivize firms by making their development potentially profitable. More specifically, the push incentives could be subsidies, like picking up the cost for phase 1, for example, clinical trials. It could also be support, where you would try to make it cheaper for the firms developing by providing kinds of advisory, by providing smaller subsidies here and there, by giving them access to experts, by giving them access to labs, etc. And I think this is probably the typical research grant subsidy, while support today would be most commonly from antibiotic so-called pipeline coordinators like Enable or Carbex or Revive or GuardP, where you basically try to midwife the the antibiotic into existence by supporting the developer as much as possible. On the pull side, you basically have different versions of innovation prices. What you think on the pull incentive side is that, yes, it's gruesome to develop new antibiotics, but if we put this pot of gold at the finish line, then maybe it feels less gruesome, and more investors and more companies will be willing to take the considerable risk of actually developing new antibiotics. So because there is such a big reward for whoever gets across the finish line first. And these innovation prices, they can be so-called milestone prices for firms that make it through phase 2 clinical trials. It could be so-called transferable exclusivity vouchers, which is basically allowing somebody who brings to market a much needed antibiotic to sell some other drug that they have patent on for a longer patented period. It could be so-called market entry rewards, which is essentially just a giant pile of cash to whoever brings an antibiotic addressing one of the priority pathogens, for example, to market. I will speak more in detail about the market entry rewards in a minute. But what has been missing here, and now I'm being a bit self-critical, and I'm not trying to say that we haven't done anything on this at all, but generally speaking, there's been a lot of focus on innovation, especially from us business economics people, trying to get the firms to move forward with their development of new drugs, which of course is terribly needed, and we're not in any way done with that. However, if we think about the antibiotic tripod, where we also need to take into account access and stewardship, so access for populations worldwide for new antibiotics, or 2 new antibiotics, and stewardship, i.e. making sure that we only use the new antibiotics when we really need it, because we have a problem and it's called antibiotic resistance, so we need to be very careful. Generally speaking, these different legs of the tripod have been addressed perhaps more in isolation than together, especially when it comes to the business and economic side and the innovation studies. So what we want to do in our project is to try to combine innovation incentives with stewardship incentives. And that is what the antibiotic susceptibility bonus is all about. Now, you've gotten a bit of a background on what's wrong with the antibiotics industry. And now I'm going to talk briefly about stewardship before presenting the actual solution, as we claim. Now, but one step in the right direction. So for those of you who don't know, stewardship on a high level is about the responsible use of new antibiotics to make sure we don't use them in the wrong situations or where they are not needed, because generally speaking, the more you use them, the greater is the risk for resistance development and degradation then of the effectiveness of the antibiotic. So you're kind of destroying the product, you're destroying the drug by using it too much. And if you didn't have to use it, that is very stupid. So this is mainly about, you can come at stewardship from different directions, from different angles. I mean, it's about us as patients finishing our therapies and not flushing half the dosage down the toilet or something like that. It's about avoiding misprescription, which could be a diagnostic problem at doctors' facilities. But it's also about avoiding excessive use, and that use can of course happen with healthcare regulators, patients, and doctors, but it can also be influenced by firms developing the drug, and that is the focus of our project, to, as we said, align industry incentives with AMR control goals. So help firms think not only about bankruptcy and a chaogen, and not only about innovating, but also about stewardship, which you realize from my presentation is kind of a tall order, but it's nevertheless important. So we see this as an interesting exploratory type of first step in starting to bring these issues onto the same table. So we're essentially exploring or building a new incentive, and we're not claiming it to be new the world, and we're piggybacking on some old incentives, but we are definitely adding a new dimension, which is that of stewardship, as promised. Who are we then? Well, the ASB project team is researchers from University of Calgary in Canada, University Hospital of Geneva in Switzerland, and Uppsala University here in Sweden. But we're not only a international team, we're also a multidisciplinary team, where although we focus on the challenges facing firms and how stewardship could be improved, we come from slightly different backgrounds. We have economists looking at the big picture, healthcare system level. We have business scholars like myself who focus much more on the firm and the decision making in single firms. And we have our people from the clinical research and prescription side from the University Hospital. So we try to come together and have different perspectives on this problem that we're addressing. And let's see, so what is this problem? Well, we need to both stimulate innovation and stewardship at the same time. This has been hard to combine. And again, I'm on a little bit of thin ice because I've been part of attempts of trying to do this before. But in a few projects, we end up actually being much stronger on the innovation side than on the stewardship side, even though we try to do stewardship and innovation because it's really hard. So this project is exclusively devoted to that. So if we fail, then we can't, there's no rug to sweep that under. It's going to be a spectacular failure. So we kind of scope the whole project here to really focus on getting these two components together. And why do we need this? Well, maybe you haven't thought about that, or didn't know about it, but there are actually no incentives for firms to engage in stewardship. And that you might think like, is that really true? Well, I would go even further and claim that it's actually it's the opposite. They are incentivized to act in a way that undermines stewardship. Incentivized by whom, you might ask? Well, by us or whoever the we are, the people, or the governments, the health regulators, etc. And let me explain that a bit. I mean, first of all, you have this. It's extremely hard to turn a profit. There's an urgency to sell, so that, I mean, you probably would sell your bookshelves and printers and stuff just to avoid bankruptcy, right? So you want to sell your drug as soon as you get it out the door. Because of course, otherwise you will, I mean, if you're the owner, you're going to lose the company. If you're an employee, you're going to lose your job. And also the last 15 years of R&Ding. So trying to save the company is something that everybody in the company is generally very committed to do for obvious reasons then. But adding to this, that you're trying to sink or swim, so to speak, that in 10, 12 years or so, generic, I mean, you run out of the patent, you lose the patent, and generic entry happens. So anybody can make your drug, and some will, and it will be even more difficult for you to get your money back. So there is this incentive for antibiotic developers to, as soon as they get their new antibiotic approved, to sell as much as possible to save their lives. No, not to save their lives, but to save pretty much everything else: the company, the drug, colleagues, etc. So we shouldn't be too surprised that this is what happens, because that's what I mean by the incentive, that actually the system is constructed such that if you have to guess what's going to happen, this is what's going to happen. They're going to sell as much as possible. And this happens mostly in middle-income countries, middle-income markets. Here is the marketing of antibiotics, which of course is for the purpose of selling more. And you have a couple of different kinds of marketing: to specialists, to primary care physicians, to in conferences, on TV, etc. Also straight to nurses in places where that's allowed. And on average, there's a 4.2% of sales spent on marketing, which is not a terrible amount, but it still indicates that companies are trying to boost their sales by these active means to get the sales up, to save the company, or just to make profit for any other reason. And this is problematic then, because there's a misalignment of incentives. The government, the healthcare system, and everyone wants us to steward new antibiotics, but the way incentives are actually structured, we're asking drowning companies to sink, or I mean, that's kind of what we expect from them, while the drowning companies are going to sell. That is what would be natural, and it's not illegal. So that's what's going to happen. So we have this misalignment between what we expect from companies and what companies do, and actually what we have, the structures we put in place that incentivizes firms. So what would this bonus I've been talking about do? Well, basically, it would be a bonus that rewards developers whose drugs remain effective. So this is kind of a kitchen door attempt at getting at companies not pushing sales, not marketing them unnecessarily or aggressively, and not perhaps trying to get them used for indications that it's not necessary, or for animals such. So basically, avoid non-prudent sales and marketing tactics. This is a bonus that would stage over time, because of course it's a long-term issue, and the idea is to disincentivize the pushing of sales, and the bonus then essentially compensate for lost sales. So we don't want this panic selling by companies that think they're going to go bankrupt. It's better that we, or the thinking here is that we don't want panic selling by these firms. Of course, that they have to do that in the first place is a problem, and we should address that, but that's not what we're doing here. We want to compensate them instead, so that they don't do that, because we need to steward the new antibiotics, and we can pick up the bill as healthcare systems instead of having this happen. So how does this bonus idea fit into the broader landscape? Why is it needed? How could it be combined with other incentives? For example, market entry rewards. I'm going to focus on market entry rewards. So market entry rewards, what are they? Well, as I said, it was one of these innovation prizes. It's a called pull incentive. You get it if you bring a certain antibiotic or an antibiotic targeting certain pathogens to market, so that it can get to patients. So it's a big prize. It's been much discussed in the last 5+ years. And the idea is to basically put up a very big innovation prize, or market entry reward as it's called, so that many companies will try to push their R&D forward. And what you're doing, if we think of it from an analytical standpoint, what we're doing if we're giving an innovation prize is that we are creating some kind of artificial sales, right? Because we had this problem that the red side was bigger than the green side. Well, now we're pumping up the green side, but it's not sales. So it's not more consumption of the drug, but it's just more revenue to compensate for the development costs. So that is what a MER does, a market entry reward. If we want to put it on a development pipeline like this, you can see that it's given at market entry. However, the size of the market entry reward and the specification for what kind of drug is going to be rewarded makes it have an effect down or upstream in the pipeline, if you will. And that is the idea. And that is why the market entry reward is a sensible also combination with the ASD. So these very large entry rewards have been proposed both by the DRIVE-AB and the UK AMR review, the so-called O'Neill report. I've been involved in some of this work, but as I said a bit self-critically, it's difficult to cover the stewardship side, and I guess it's not entirely unfair to say that both these projects kind of failed in doing that. How to incentivize stewardship while doling out these considerable amounts of money. So Eva, feel free to interrupt me if there are any questions or
no questions so far, but
good.
yes.
All right. So these market entry awards are so far a popular solution to the innovation problem, but they are bereft of any proper stewardship component. So we thought that maybe this is a good laboratory for the ASB to start thinking about how could a MER market entry reward be combined with the antibiotic susceptibility bonus. So a bonus for keeping your drug effective by minimizing sales. Where are we? We are back in the colorful one. So a market entry reward, this would be an example. The point is just a big lump of money on the first day when you reach the market to compensate for the considerable costs you had, instead of a slowly but too low growth in sales. As we remember, here on the first year is where Achaogen died. So they came out the door with a great antibiotic that was much anticipated, and then they had to close down shop after 1 year. So this is where you would then have a kind of a wall of money to solve Achaogen's problems. Now, of course, this didn't happen because this hasn't happened yet, but at least it's being developed and it's been moving forward. So yeah, a bit late, but still. So this is the market entry reward. The market entry reward with the ASB would look slightly different. First of all, you would have lower sales. That's the whole point, actually, because there is an assumption that there is excessive selling going on. There are, of course, references for up to 50% of sales being excessive and unnecessary. I can't speak to that, but I know I've read the papers. But the point is, reduce sales and then compensate for that by first an initial slightly lower wall of money, and then with payments over time. And this, of course, is geared towards the idea of retaining the efficacy of the drug. So it would be staged over up to 20 years. And in practice, it would be more money. But we argue it will be better spent money, because you're actually not only incentivizing innovation, but also stewardship. And that matters a lot. So if that means that it's more costly, then well, so be it. It's not chump change, but still, it's important. So it would be a smaller MER with the ASB attached, but then the money would be spent over a longer period of time to basically dissuade the developer of low value uses of their drugs. So stay away from animals, stay away from pushing sales in middle income markets. And there is this idea, where is it? Yes, so an assumption here it's important to point out is that, which is, by the way, partly correct at least, is that promotion of drugs happens when they are new. So it's the patent holder that promotes drugs. You very rarely, especially in antibiotics, see a generic entry type of producer, i.e. after the patent has expired, go out and market something. That is not how it happens. It hypothetically could happen, but it hasn't happened in any great extent. So what we mean by these staged payments is that if the developer doesn't start expanding the list of indications and generally the use of the drug, and doesn't market it in the first 5-10 years, nobody's going to start spending that kind of money on marketing a drug 15 years down the line, because that is not how companies behave, because it doesn't make business sense to do it. So if you can keep the developer on the thin and narrow, as we define it, in the early years after product launch, there's a good chance of the drug actually staying away from unnecessary use. So we want to incentivize the development of new drugs, but also that they are used with care, and that they are might even focus firms on drugs that are more likely to retain effectiveness over the long term, although that, of course, is way more difficult. And we want that to happen through fewer approved indications, less marketing, less push sales, especially in countries with high burden of AMR. Sorry, checking my watch. So wrapping up, saying the same thing again, basically. But it would also protect the market entry reward, because right now the market entry reward does not have a stewardship component. So we thought this could actually support the market entry reward. Now I probably should skip all this because we have very interesting work still in progress on the magnitude, how to define the size of such a magnitude in different ways. I mean, how big should the ASB be, and what are the trade-offs? I think what's interesting here, or sad again, a lot of sadness in this topic, unfortunately, but 237 million is the value of the future sales of new antibiotics, the 10 most profitable new antibiotics, according to one of our papers. While the general costs can be up to $1 billion. So even the most profitable antibiotics are bleeding money like no one else. Which on the one hand suggests that these kind of innovation incentives with stewardship, with or without stewardship components, are very important, but it also means that the substituting sales would be cheaper. So actually the ASP would be much cheaper than we initially could expect. But finally, it also means that the antibiotics industry is in more trouble every day. Achaogen was not any kind of rare bird, if you will. So we're having a lot of fun with this, developing it further. Of course, today we also have inflation to work with, and other cases of uncertainty that also need to be folded into this type of design. So it's not easy, but it's quite a lot of fun. And as I said in the early part of this presentation, it's an exploratory first part of trying to combine innovation and stewardship incentives at the firm level. So that is what we've tried to do, and it has proven difficult, but possible, and it has raised a number of new interesting questions, we believe. So we're very happy about this project. Thankful to the Swedish Research Council and JPI-AMR, as well as to you guys for joining into this session and listening to what we've been doing. So if you want to learn more, check out some of our papers online. These are the main ones, others to follow. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy to take questions and criticisms.
Thank you, Olof, so much for this presentation. Great explanation of what this new incentive would mean. If there are any questions, again, feel free to raise your hand and speak them out or write them in the chat. Meanwhile, we have a couple of minutes to two, but one question that comes to me as I'm listening to you is, where is that money gonna come from?
That is a good question. For several reasons. I mean, there's a willingness to pay side of things, but then there's also the legal side of things, because of course you have to be able to enforce all kind of deals on some weird international level, which is a problem, I think, across the AMR field. How can you actually force some company that registers in the Caymans or in some, to actually do as told or as agreed? But I think generally speaking, this will have to be government money, or I think it probably should be. That's my personal opinion. But of course, we know that in this field, there's also a lot of philanthropist money going around supporting the work in AMR to get innovation going. I mean, I'm thinking about Carbex, Revive, but also governments like in Enable, and of course the bulk of research funds coming from the government. So, but it becomes a political issue, which is why I think it's important to explore these kind of ideas quite in detail, but also be honest about some of the controversies contained in solving problems one way or the other. The good thing about AMR is that it's such a dumpster fire in the first place that I think almost any solution is actually better than what we have right now.
Another thing that comes to mind while people think about their questions, it's how will you, by what measures will you test or award that susceptibility? You know, will you have some thresholds of certain key aspects? Will you, because I feel like, for example, if we think about measuring the percentage of still susceptible strains to that particular new drug, that will involve incredible amount of work on getting samples, testing those samples. We know that surveillance is not equal or across the world. And also how a bacterial strain or a particular pathogen might react to a drug, or the risk of accumulating resistance will be different depending on the kind of drug and also on the kind of pathogen that it targets, right? Some of the new drugs are not really so new because there's already persistent resistance somewhere, so those might come easier. Some maybe new mechanism of action will have more difficulties to kind of get that resistance going. Is there in your equation putting all those things into motion and having them in account when awarding this susceptibility bonus?
Yes, we have done work on this. Of course, it's work that I try not to present personally because you are starting to move away from, definitely from my area of expertise. But we have been looking at that, and of course there is very little of this surveillance going on. Some of the big companies do it. There are some nascent attempts to start keeping track, but of course there's no working global surveillance of antibiotic use or susceptibility. I think rather the numbers we get are from the hospitals when the drugs don't work anymore, which is of course, but it's not actually, so it needs to be put in place, and that's also part of the work done in the project, which I am just really bad at explaining. But there was an idea of trying to build on the EARS network to increase surveillance, because of course without surveillance you couldn't actually do this. But then again, we still need more surveillance anyways, so it's just another important thing to address in AMR. So we felt that we'll take that on while we go, because we are kind of touching upon a lot of the usual suspect when it comes to problems in AMR, and this is definitely one of them.
Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking as you were presenting the project is how much it touches into different aspects of the problem, right? You have the stewardship part, you have the biology part, obviously, of how the specific drug and target combination might have a different development of resistance. You are also targeting the problem with the companies themselves. So it's very multidisciplinary and very broad within the AMR field, right? So it's very great, and also very great to think about it. I don't know if it would really become a reality in the future, that there will be some sort of, maybe it works for some drugs and not for other drugs. Maybe that's something that it could happen in the future, but it's definitely a very, very thoughtful process to go into it.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Eva. Yeah, what we wanted to do was to take a first step. Yeah. And if that means getting all the skeletons out of closets, then that's what it means. But at least now we've started, and we have gotten quite a lot of attention for this on this project. So I think even though it's difficult, it's appreciated and a bit fascinating, it seems, at least to us.
Great. I guess the economists are not very used to think also about the biology and the stewardship of the system, right? So it's really cool. All right, we are 4 minutes past 2. If nobody has any questions or anything to pose to Olof, I think we're gonna close the webinar for this month. And I welcome you back on the month of May for our next webinar. Meanwhile, you can listen to our podcast. New episode will be dropping soon, not next week, but the week after. And you can also be updated of our things through our website. So thank you so much, Olof. Thank you, everybody, for joining us and listening to us. And I hope to have you back soon. Bye.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you, everyone.